What happens inside you when you face something absolutely overwhelming? I mean, not just emotionally or psychologically, but physically. Your body and brain aren't passive bystanders. They have incredibly complex, sometimes deeply surprising ways of reacting when pushed right to the very edge of existence.
It's true. The human system is designed with survival in mind. But when extreme inputs hit, whether that's sudden physical force, a severe lack of oxygen, or profound psychological stress, the internal responses are both remarkably capable and unexpectedly vulnerable.
And that's exactly our mission today. We're taking a deep dive into the multi-layered ways the human system responds to trauma and life-threatening situations. We've pulled sources covering clinical trauma itself, the nuts and bolts of how physical injury actually happens, the specific physiology of oxygen deprivation, and even those profound, often described as spiritual moments right at the very edge of life, like near-death experiences.
Right. Our goal is really to help you understand what happens, peeling back the layers from the microscopic level of, say, brain chemistry, all the way up to how we perceive reality and adapt in the long term.
And yeah, we'll look at where things can go wrong, but also the incredible capacity for resilience it's got built into the system.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's start by looking at the landscape of trauma itself. Our sources make it clear that trauma isn't just a single, sudden, shocking event. There's acute trauma, sure, but they also define chronic and complex trauma.
Right. And complex trauma is particularly highlighted. It involves repeated, often severe, and prolonged exposure. What makes it complex is that this typically happens in childhood or adolescence within relationships where escaping feels impossible.
Oh,
Think of caregivers who were supposed to provide safety but were actually the source of harm. That sense of being trapped is crucial and helps explain responses like, persistent negative mood and feeling constantly on edge. The sources note that complex PTSD symptoms often go beyond standard PTSD, affecting things like a person's sense of self, their ability to regulate emotions, and the relationships.
that adds a really significant layer to understanding trauma. And speaking of the events themselves, the sources pull some fascinating data from the World Mental Health Survey on how common certain traumatic events actually are. What kind of events top the list for exposure?
Well, the most commonly reported event was the sudden loss of a loved one, especially if it was violent or unexpected.
Okay.
About 31% of respondents reported this. That's roughly 1/6 of all traumatic event exposures in that study.
1/6 just from losing someone violently or unexpectedly?
Right.
Wow. What was the second most common?
Witnessing death or serious bodily harm to someone else. That was reported by around 23%, making up another 1/6 of exposures.
So just those two types of events account for a massive portion of reported trauma exposure. What else rounds out the top 5 most common?
After those, it's muggings at about 14.5%, severe motor vehicle collisions at 14.0%, and then life-threatening injury or illness at 11.8%. These top 5 alone represent about 50% of all reported traumatic event exposures in that survey data. It gives you a real sense of the scale of these experiences.
It really grounds us in the reality of how prevalent these events are. And the sources point out an interesting bimodal risk pattern for developing PTSD, right?
Yes, that's right. It seems the highest risks are during childhood and adolescence, and then again later in life after age 65.
Interesting. Now, when we think about events like motor vehicle collisions or severe injury, the sources also get into the physical, how the actual mechanisms of injury. Trauma isn't just the emotional events, it's the physical forces at play.
Absolutely. The body takes the hit. Blunt trauma, for instance, comes from things like car crashes, falls, even something as simple as falling out of bed or crush injuries. It's about forces tearing tissues, creating pressure that can cause damage, and the internal movement of organs like the brain leading to, coup contra coup injuries where it impacts the skull on opposite sides.
Right, like in a car crash where they talk about unrestrained occupants having different injury patterns if they go up and over the dashboard or down and under it. The way you hit things, and crucially, whether you're properly restrained, completely changes the damage pathway.
Precisely. Then you have penetrating trauma, gunshot wounds, stabbings, impalements. Here, the speed, the size, and the path of the object are critical. Gunshot wounds, for example, aren't just about the bullet's straight line. Factors like the bullet wobbling or tumbling, the spin from the rifling in the barrel, or how a hollow point deforms, all create larger injury cavities. These are classified as open injuries because the wound connects to the outside.
And burns. which aren't
Yeah.
just fire, right? It's thermal burns from heat or cold, chemical burns, electrical burns.
Yeah, and the sources mention how fast hot water can cause damaged water at 140 Fahrenheit can cause deep burns in just 3 seconds.
3 seconds. That's incredibly fast. And the sources also highlight how specific populations are particularly vulnerable. Pregnant women, for instance.
Yes, they face increased risk from trauma for both themselves and the fetus. Their balance shifts, increasing fall risk. Fetal vulnerability is higher after 24 weeks when they're less protected by the pelvis. And fascinatingly, fetal hemoglobin has a higher affinity for carbon monoxide, making CO poisoning in a pregnant burn patient a major concern.
Wow, I didn't know that about the CO affinity.
Yeah, it's significant.
And for children, injury patterns shift with age. MVCs as passengers or pedestrians are leading causes. Falls are most frequent under 5.
But tragically, firearms become a much bigger factor after age 10. Knowing about car seat requirements by age and weight becomes a really practical prevention point stemming directly from this data.
It really underscores how the physical mechanics of injury are intertwined with our biology and stage of life.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've looked at the types of trauma and how the physical damage happens. Now let's move inside. What happens in the body and brain when that stress hits? This is where the physiology kicks in.
This is a really complex area, and the sources dive deep, but the key thing to grasp is how the brain and hormonal systems react. Central to this is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
Right, the stress response system.
Think of it as your body's main stress response control panel.
Right, it releases stress hormones like cortisol. Early research focused just on cortisol levels, noticing some PTSD patients had surprisingly low or blunted responses. But the more recent understanding, highlighted in the sources, shifts the focus to the sensitivity of the cells that receive the cortisol signal, the glucocorticoid receptors.
Exactly. It's less about how much hormone is floating around and more about how loudly the body hears that hormone signal.
That's a great way to put it. It's like the volume is turned up on the stress signal, even if the hormone level isn't necessarily through the roof.
Precisely. And then there are key brain structures involved. The amygdala deep inside is like your brain's alert system, processing fear and emotional reactions. It's thought to be fully developed relatively early, by adolescence. The sources note that increased growth in the amygdala has been linked to anxiety and trauma disorders.
Okay, so the alarm system and the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain.
That part, especially the medial and dorsolateral sections, is involved in higher level functions like working memory and controlling impulses. It matures much later, well into early adulthood.
Oh, okay.
And this is where it gets interesting. The amygdala, the alarm, develops early, but the PFC, the brakes, develops late. The sources hypothesize that this differential development rate contributes to why adolescence and early adulthood can be periods of increased stress reactivity. The PFC normally inhibits the amygdala's alarm.
Right.
And studies show reduced volume in the medial PFC in people with PTSD, fewer breaks, essentially.
So if the alarm system is fully online early, but the part of your brain meant to calm it down is still under construction, you're more vulnerable during those formative years. That totally makes sense.
Exactly.
Now, the sources list a whole symphony of chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, and hormones that are affected. It gets pretty technical. But what are the most important concepts for us to understand about how these chemicals shift after trauma?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Instead of listing every single one, maybe let's think about them in categories. You have chemicals that essentially amplify the stress response or promote anxiety,
Okay.
like norepinephrine at high levels, which can actually disrupt the PFC's function, or CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone,
Yeah.
which directly increases anxiety signals in the amygdala.
Right, so things that ramp it up.
Then you have chemicals that act more like brakes or dampeners on the stress response. GABA is a key inhibitory neurotransmitter. Lower levels are seen in PTSD and are thought to maybe be a risk factor.
Mm-hmm.
Allopregnanolone is another. Lower levels are linked to increased anxiety and difficulty overcoming fear responses.
So, dampeners.
Yeah.
And what about resilience? Are there chemicals involved there?
Yes. Importantly, there are chemicals linked to resilience, DHEA and DHES, for example. Higher levels of these are associated with stress resilience and seem protective against PTSD and depression. A lower ratio of DHEA to cortisol has been found after childhood trauma. It's not just about the stress hormones themselves, but these other factors that help buffer against their impact.
That's fascinating. And how does this relate to treatments like SSRIs, which target serotonin?
Serotonin, or 5-HT, is another crucial one. Stress can deplete tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin. SSRIs, which are first-line treatments for PTSD, work on the serotonin system. It really shows how complex and fundamental the impact of trauma is on these chemical systems.
So the key insight here is that trauma doesn't just make you feel stressed. It can profoundly rewire the very chemical signals your brain and body use to manage stress, fear, and even your ability to bounce back. It's a complex biological signature.
Absolutely. And while we've dug into some complex biology, it's crucial to remember, as the sources point out, that most individuals exposed to potentially traumatic events do not develop clinically significant mental illness. The system is vulnerable, but also incredibly resilient.
That's a vital point. But the sources also touch on how trauma, especially childhood trauma, can have really profound later effects, even linking it to things like psychotic symptoms, hallucinations, and paranoid ideation.
Yes, one study highlighted found a pretty strong link. The number of different ways a patient experienced hallucinations was predictive of childhood trauma. Just one traumatic event could increase the risk of paranoid ideation by like 2.5 times and verbal hallucinations by nearly 5 times.
Wow.
And severe childhood abuse and neglect specifically were linked to the severity of hallucinations, while delusions were more associated with the total trauma experienced. It shows just how deep the roots of trauma can go, affecting fundamental brain function and perception.
It's a powerful reminder of the long shadow trauma can cast. Now, let's step further out to the absolute edge of life. What happens when the body is pushed to extreme physical limits, like a severe lack of oxygen?
Okay, so this brings us to hypoxia, insufficient oxygen supply to tissues. There are different ways this can happen. Hypoxemic, where there's low oxygen in the blood itself.
Right.
Circulatory or ischemic, due to lack of blood flow. Anemic, where the blood can't carry enough oxygen, like in carbon monoxide poisoning. And histotoxic, where the cells actually can't use the oxygen, like in cyanide poisoning.
And the physical effects are devastating, right? From rapid breathing and heart rate to confusion, neurological damage like cortical blindness.
And ultimately coma and death, if not corrected. The body does try to compensate, but it's a losing battle without oxygen.
How does it try?
Well, physiological responses include hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, which tries to redirect blood in the lungs to areas getting more air, and the hypoxic ventilatory response, which just makes you breathe harder and faster.
But limited effectiveness in severe cases.
Exactly. And the sources mention explosive decompression as a really extreme scenario that exemplifies pushing the system to these limits.
Right, the vacuum exposure studies.
They cite animal studies showing the severe effects: lung damage, the heart rate dropping dramatically, bradycardia, possibly a reflex. The brain experiences what's called cortical silence very rapidly.
Cortical silence.
Yeah, electrical activity in the outer layers just stops within seconds, around 45 seconds in one chimpanzee study cited. Even if survival was possible with rapid return to pressure, there could be lasting neurological and behavioral changes. It shows just how vulnerable the brain is to a lack of oxygen and how these extreme conditions can bring the system to its absolute breaking point, potentially triggering near-death states.
And that brings us to a phenomenon that occurs at exactly that threshold. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, the sources define them as these hyperlucid experiences where people perceive consciousness apart from their body at the time of actual or threatened death. Often, people who have them feel they are deeply spiritual.
Yeah, and we have this fascinating historical account in the sources from a 19th century physician, Forbes Winslow, describing a gentleman who survived being hanged.
Hanged, wow.
Yeah. He recounted strange mental visions that were most pleasing, where scenes from his entire early life revived in minutest particular, and forgotten faces were vividly recalled.
That feeling of immense subjective experience unfolding in a very short objective time. The sources call that time collapse or time dilation, depending on your perspective.
Exactly. And what's really insightful from that 19th century account is how he described these revived scenes as pictorial sketches and paintings.
Right, versus today.
Compare that to how modern NDE accounts often use terms like a movie or screens or monitors.
That difference in description, driven by the technology and language available in their time, is a crucial point.
It really is. It suggests that while the underlying experience at the edge of life might have universal elements, the language we use to describe it is filtered through our cultural and technological lens. The core phenomenon might be similar, but how we package it varies.
That's a really compelling insight. And the sources also bring in modern science looking at NDEs, specifically the 2024 University of Michigan EEG study.
Yes, they recorded brain activity in dying patients and made a remarkable observation, as they put it, of a surge of highly organized brain activity shortly after life support was removed in 2 patients.
So some detectable brain state correlating potentially.
It's a piece of recent scientific evidence looking at the brain state near death, potentially offering clues. It's early days, but fascinating.
Definitely. And the NDE phenomenon isn't just the experience itself, it's the after effects, which the sources categorize.
Right, they can be profound. Psychologically, people often report losing their fear of death, becoming less materialistic, more focused on others. Spiritually, there's often a greatly increased interest. There can be physical changes like shifts in metabolism, sleep needs, or increased sensitivities.
And socially.
Socially, relationships might change, people might seek different friends, or even occupations that better align with their newfound values.
It's clear that these moments at the very edge can be incredibly transformative, impacting not just the mind but the body and perceived connection to something larger.
Absolutely. And tying all of this together, the trauma, the physical injury, the physiological chaos, the experiences at the edge, the sources loop back to a concept we mentioned earlier: resilience.
Yes, that's so important.
Despite the intense vulnerability we see in our systems under extreme stress, it's a powerful point that most individuals exposed to potentially traumatic events do not develop clinically significant mental illness.
Resilience isn't just a trait someone is born with, though.
No, exactly. It's better understood as a process actively developing adaptive ways of thinking and behaving to navigate overwhelming stressors. This involves strengthening positive relationships, learning to manage intense emotions, and identifying and building on personal strengths. It's something you cultivate.
And prevention strategies are critical too, as outlined in the trauma sources, both psychological and physical.
Absolutely. Establishing both physical and psychological safety is foundational. Preventing further harm within the care setting, sometimes called iatrogenic re-traumatization, is also vital.
Right, not making things worse.
Exactly. Providing trauma-informed education helps people understand symptoms, normalize their experiences, and find hope. Encouraging learning about trauma, addressing sleep problems, and acknowledging loss and grief are all important parts of recovery and prevention.
Which connects back beautifully to basic physical injury prevention, seatbelts, proper car seats, helmets, fall prevention, checking your home for hazards. It's all about creating layers of safety and support.
For a system that is both vulnerable and incredibly capable, it truly shows the dual nature of the human system when faced with trauma and the edge of life.
Yeah, there's immense vulnerability under duress, but also this incredible layered capacity to react, adapt, and even generate these profound subjective experiences when pushed to the absolute limit. So we've journeyed through the stark reality of trauma and physical injury, explored the intricate biological dance of our stress response system, felt the physical limits tested by conditions like hypoxia, and stepped into the mysterious territory of the brain right at the edge of consciousness, including the compelling subjective experience of NDEs.
It paints this complex picture of vulnerability and astonishing capability within the human system.
Given these intricate physiological responses to trauma and stress, and the intriguing culturally influenced reports and even detected brain activity associated with near-death states, what does this all tell us about the fundamental relationship between our physical being, our consciousness, and the limits of what we currently understand?
Right. What might these extreme moments reveal about the everyday workings of our minds that we never notice?